The Peloponnesian War. Um, right off the bat, you can see on the map there a schematic that shows the alliances at the start of the war. And mainly there not just to see who's fighting who, but also to get a sense of that this is taking the entire Greek world, involving the entire Hellenic world. That's what Thucydides says. He says, in fact, his comment is, and this is an interesting one here, he says, this is even bigger than the Trojan War. And he actually goes and he talks about how, this was the scale of the Trojan War, but this is the scale of the Peloponnesian War. It's bigger. And it reminds us that kind of everything was judged on the basis of the Trojan War. And the Trojan War was treated as historical fact, not just some legendary thing that happened. So anyway, you can see that the green side are the Spartans or the Peloponnesians or the Lacedaemonians. You'll see all three names for them. Are kind of land-based, whereas the Athenians and their allies are very sea-based. I was going to say water-based. Anyway, it makes them sound like paint. But before we get to the actual Peloponnesian War, which doesn't start until 431, we've got to do a little background. So does anybody remember what was happening in 480, 479 BC? Roughly. Anyone? And I'm thinking armed conflict. Who were the Greeks fighting back then? Yes. So 479 is when the Greeks they defeated the Persians and they chased them away. And so now the Greeks were in control of the Aegean. And pretty much, yeah. First of all, their own land was secure. So all that bit was safe from the Persians, reasonably. And this is still up for grabs. And in theory, the Persian War had been started because the Greeks were trying to help all those cities on what's Ionia, the coast of Turkey. They all wanted to be free and away from Persian rule. And so that's the next step now, is to go over to Ionia and establish Greek independence. Anyway, so the threat is still there, right? It was a huge force that came. They did chase them away, but it's still there. So the Greeks looked to Sparta particularly, because Sparta was looked upon as the most powerful state, the most militarily successful state, to provide leadership. And they did provide leadership. Unfortunately, Sparta always had a reputation, and it's hard to judge how well or deserved it was. But the standard interpretation that the ancient Greeks had, and that we generally follow, was that the Spartans were not good at being leaders of the bigger, wider Greek world. They had no problem with this. The mainland of Greece, they had no problem with being the leaders. Corinth, Thebes, Athens, like all those areas, Thessaly would look to Sparta for guidance. Or if there was some kind of a threat or a problem, they'd look to Sparta. If there was an internal squabble between two neighboring cities, one of them would appeal to Sparta. Once you get further afield, they tended to have difficulty dealing with that. And the idea was that once Spartans lived very strict, tough lives. Once they got farther away from Greece and they got introduced to more luxurious ways of living, there was a worry that they would be corrupted by that. So, for instance, a Spartan general and king named Pausanias went over. He was conducting the war against Persia to keep all the yellow bits on the east coast of the Aegean free, or to get them to be free. But he was kind of heavy-handed. There were accusations that he was being corrupted by Persian money. And in fact, he was recalled and he was punished by the Spartans. So it wasn't a matter of the other Greeks were not happy with him. The Spartans themselves weren't happy with him, which suggests that it was something serious and real. Anyway, so Sparta kind of took a step back from their leadership role, and Athens filled the power vacuum. And it's not like they became an empire ruling over all of Greece. They just took the leadership role. We need to have somebody that we can appeal to, who will guide us in our decision making, that kind of a thing. I suppose being the hegemon is a bit like being the chair of a committee. You're not telling everyone what to do, but you're kind of organizing everyone. So the Athenians started up, and you can see how soon this is after the Persian War. In 477, they organized what we call the Delian League, what they called Athens and her allies. Delian League sounds a little bit more like the UN, right? Or the League of Nations, whereas it really was Athens as the main force and her allies. It's like a Gilligan's Island and the rest. Anyway, and they had about 150 member, they say cities, but it was really 150 poleis scattered all throughout, and you can see the scatter pattern.
Those are all the poleis.
Each one, it's a polis. It might be some little wee community, more like a village. It could be something that was a bigger, more like a city. All kinds of different sizes. They started with 150 members. It grew from that, but 150 is a lot, just to start with.
All policies, right?
Yes, every one of them is one of these city-states. They're individual. They have their own autonomy. And this is it. It might be some tiny little dot of an island with one small city-state or polis on it, and maybe a few hundred people. That's it. Or it could be a few thousand. Yeah. So for the next about 50 years, Thucydides actually calls it the 50-year period. There's all kinds of political toing and froing in Greece. By the way, I don't know if you remember the name of the person who was the architect of, well, there it is there. The architect of Athens' victory over the Persians. It was Themistocles. He was the one who, we need a strong navy. We should abandon the city, fight this battle on the sea, not on the land. And there's a bust of good old Themistocles. So in 480, 479, he's like the grand architect. He's like the Churchill of the war. In 470, he'd become sufficiently unpopular that he was ostracized. That's fast. To go from hero to zero in 10 years, well, less than 10 years. And we actually have some ostraca with his name on them. Why was he ostracized? Well, this is one of the themes that you get in Greek history, and that is that there is a tendency for the Hellenic peoples in the ancient world to band together really well when there's an external force and an external enemy. Once that external enemy is gone, they they start going at each other and they eat each other. And so you had political rivalry going on. And so Themistocles had political rivals. One of them he was a strategos. He started to have some successes militarily, and now he becomes really popular. And he doesn't really like Themistocles that much. So it's not just a matter of live and let live. It's now I can attack my enemies. And you never miss a chance to attack your enemies if you live in ancient Greece. So yes, he was ostracized. But here's the other recurring pattern for like the next, what are we at, 470? For about the next 70 years or longer. So he went to Ionia, all those Greek cities on the east coast of the Aegean in what's now Turkey. And he actually became the ruler of an area of Ionia called Magnesia. He was working for the Persians. I know. Remember Hippias? When Hippias got kicked out of Athens as the tyrant, he went over to the Persians. Yeah, Themistocles was now a ruler under the Persians. The Persians had no problem with this. It's like, yeah, you were our enemy. Yeah, you made us lose. We see that there's some really good talent there, so we're quite happy to pay you and to be on our team. It's kind of like it's like professional sports. If I can't, this guy beat us, so we're just going to offer him more money to have him join our team. And there's proof of it. There's coinage produced by Magnesia in the 460s. The circle with the dot in it is a theta. So T-H-E, Themistocles. There's Themistocles' smiling profile. I'm not sure if he's smiling. But this would happen. This is not the first time that a Greek fighting on the Greek side, fighting against the Persians, finds himself working for the Persians for big money. Anyway, back to the prelude to the Peloponnesian War. One of the big things is that Athens had to rebuild. So most of the other cities hadn't really suffered very much. Certainly Sparta hadn't, Corinth, but Athens had received the brunt of Persian wrath. Because, of course, remember, they were the ones before the Persian War who had gone over, sent troops to Ionia to help Miletus attack and sack the Persian city of Sardis. So the Persians were particularly annoyed with the Athenians, and they took their bad humor out on them twice. They sacked the city twice. They rampaged through the countryside. So they lost 2 harvests. They had lost a lot of infrastructure just in terms of buildings being destroyed, temples being destroyed, and they'd lost people just in fighting. That's a lot to overcome. Luckily, Athens had the ability they had some natural resources to help overcome that. One of the things they had, as you see, Laurion Antique, is there's a lot of silver in the south of Attica. And so they were able to get the mines back in production. And basically the state was able to produce silver, mint coins, and buy things like food. Because there would have been, you can imagine that first year or two after they chased the Persians away, there would have been some food insecurity going on. And then the Delian League also provided funds, mainly to purchase ships and train crews so that you could have a navy that would repel any Persian incursion. That's good. But a little of that money could slip in. The Athenians took a small cut to be the head of the Delian League, and they used that for things like rebuilding their city. And they justified that. Their feeling was, we took one for the team owes us to rebuild. So one of the big things for going to food, and it's easy to overlook this because the ancient writers didn't think about this very much, but food insecurity. Way back when, I mentioned that Athens is really good at growing, what are the crops they're good at? Olives, and to wash down the olives? Wine. Yeah, grapes. Yeah, true, they don't actually grow wine. But grain is another problem. It's like the old ad with the spaghetti tree. Grain's another problem. That's the thing that you need to have on a day-to-day basis. They don't grow it very well. Grain does grow really well on this map. Does anybody happen to know? It's actually still an area where it grows. Well, the Black Sea in general, the area of the Ukraine specifically, that's still a breadbasket. So the Athenians were able to get grain in from the Black Sea area. And think about this in the background. Athens is a naval power. It makes this trip a lot better if you can control the seas, particularly this bit. So, anyway, the fact that in a fairly short time, Athens not only recovered its population, but had a booming population. It was by far the biggest, most populous city and most populous area in all of Greece from having been sacked. That suggests, I mean, it certainly was a great bounce back and resiliency, but in particular, they had enough food to feed the people so they could reproduce and then feed all the, like kind of like an Athenian baby boom. But you need to just, the basic feeding them has to be set up, and obviously it was. So at the same time, so while that's going on, and Athens is just rebuilding, Sparta was having trouble soon after the Persian invasion, and that was that there was a massive earthquake. Now this is about 15 years afterwards. Massive earthquake which devastated Sparta and killed hundreds of citizens. Hundreds of citizens doesn't sound like, it's not like tens of thousands, but Sparta actually, their strength rested on a relatively small population of extremely well-trained, expert hoplites. A small force of Spartans could just blow you out. I was going to say blow you out of the water, but they're not a navy. Just wipe you out. But as a result, it's a small number. And if there's any kind of a dent put in that, it's a big dent. So even just losing hundreds of citizens is really difficult for them. Yeah, we don't get into too much, but just, a quick thing about the Spartans. So the way the Spartan society worked is that all males were soldiers. You didn't have citizen farmers. They had a group called helots, which were virtual slaves. But they had slaves and a servant class that did all the farming. Spartans didn't engage in trade. That was other people. They'd be like resident foreigners. If you are a citizen, a male citizen, you served in the army. That was the only thing you did. So it was a very militaristic society. And they had gone that way and made that conscious decision way back, I think about 700 BC. It goes way back. So it was really well established. And I mean, boys were taken from their parents at a very young age for very tough training. Yeah.
So they're like the Navy SEAL Republic.
At least. I mean, just to give you a quick example, from the time you're like 7 until you're an adult soldier, you're basically in training. you did have some rudimentary education, but it was basically military training. So as a teen, for instance, you were not fed enough on purpose. And so you would have to go out and raid the area you lived in to steal enough food to, not just survive, but I mean, if you're going through that much training, you need more calories. And if you're a teenage boy, you need more calories because you're growing muscle. You got punished if you got caught, not because you were stealing, but because you got caught. So yeah, it was pretty tough. But at the end of it, those that came out of that system were tough. I mean, if you do one thing and only do that all day, every day, you get good at it, whether you want to be or not. Okay. So anyway, but they had this. So the Messenians, who were they were a group of peoples who basically had to serve all of these professional soldiers. They took the opportunity to revolt, and it was a 9-year war. There is Messenia. So you can see Sparta is in the black square. Messenia is way over to the west. And in particular, there's a mountain there called Mount Itome. And the Messenians had gone there. And it wasn't a matter that they were trying to conquer Sparta. They were just like, leave us alone. Let us be independent. And so they'd gone up to the mountain and were just going to stay there and not work. And that's bad enough for the Spartans, because then who's going to do all the farming? The Spartans were in such straits that they asked for help from the Athenians. And the Athenians at this point, 15 years, they had been having squabbles back and forth with the Spartans. They didn't love the Spartans anymore. And there was a kind of an intense debate. A lot of the Athenians were, whatever, just leave. No, we're not going to waste time and energy to help them. But the Athenian leader Cimon, who was instrumental in getting Themistocles ostracized, he was more pro-Spartan. He probably argued on the basis of pan-Hellenism. We don't know. But he convinced the people to send a force. We should help these people. They're Greeks, they're Hellens like us. We need to help them. Which sounds really good. It sounds like the sort of thing that we would be totally understanding. Yeah, we agree with Cimon. Unfortunately, when the Athenians arrived, the Spartans sent them home. They said, no, we don't want your help after all. So you can leave now. Fuck. And the story was that they were afraid that their own people would be corrupted by the Athenians' democratic notions, because at this point, the Athenians had just kind of perfected the whole idea of the people make every decision all the time. I'm not totally convinced by that, because the Athenians wouldn't have been sending ships and rowers. They would have been sending hoplites. And the hoplites tended to be the wealthier farmers who probably were less democratic than the people who were lower on the economic scale. I wouldn't expect hoplites typically were more conservative in Athens than rowers. So I'm not totally convinced that that was the case. Anyway, you can imagine that when Athens was sent back home with their tail between their legs, totally unappreciated, this did not do very much for Cimon's reputation, because he had just barely convinced the Athenians. So all the Athenians who said we shouldn't send a force to Sparta to help them out were completely vindicated, because now they're like, well, now not only did you do something we disagree with, but we got totally dissed as a result. Anyway, the Athenians, for their part, were, as I say, rebuilding, and to protect themselves from the Persians and also from the Spartans, from any land army, they rebuilt their walls. but this is what their walls looked like. Right? Notice the walls. It's not just around the city.
It's to the sea as well.
Yeah, and you can see there's a scale in miles. Like, this is a few kilometers between the two.
Okay.
By doing that, they basically take an inland city of Athens and they make it a port city. It now has direct access to the port, and their port city is Piraeus. They have direct access to the sea without any interference from a land army. So you cannot blockade Athens just with a land army. You'd also have to have a navy as well. But since Athens has control of the by far strongest navy in the entire Greek world, they're fine now. They can never be starved out. They can't be successfully besieged ever. Yeah, 6 kilometers long. Bits of it still survive, actually. 8 to 10 meters high, about 3 meters thick. So this is not just like some picket fence. The base was limestone, and then the top half were sun-dried bricks. You can add to this the fact that siegecraft in 5th century Greece really stunk. They were not good at besieging cities. If they tried to do that, it took forever. And the besiegers often got worn out before the city they were besieging because they needed to have supplies to keep them there, camped around. And they needed to get home to look after their crops. So besieging was not a successful event in any case. And those walls aren't going to make it any easier. Anyway, it certainly allowed them to focus, Athens to focus entirely on the navy and pretty much abandon the army. I mean, you still need to have a decent serving army, but it is not going to determine your success or failure. Anyway, as time goes on during this 50-year period between 479 and 431, and yes, that's not 50, the Delian League just continued to grow. Athens would convince Poles to join up. They even send out colonies. Now, we talked about colonies a fair bit. And why did we send out colonies in 700 or 650 BC?
Because there were too many people for the space.
Yes. Now we're sending them out for political reasons. So we might have a battle with some polis way up here somewhere. And we defeat them. And as often happens, we wipe them out. We wipe out that town, it's a small polis. We will now send a colony out there to settle it with Athenians. It was actually called a kleruki, which meant that the people who lived there were still Athenians. It wasn't like a colony where you were going out and you were setting up and creating your own identity and your own polis. This is a branch office. You still had all your Athenian rights, which makes sense because the Athenians want to make sure that you are totally loyal, because the city that the polis that they are setting up is one that probably has great strategic value, and it's really important that you always stay on the Athenian side of the fight. And by the way, Cimon in 461, 9 years after Themistocles got ostracized. They booted him out. That was 3 years after the mess of offering to help the Spartans. And a little sideline, it does show that originally, does anybody remember what ostracism was for? What was the purpose of doing that and creating that thing?
to like reduce the power of certain.
Yes, it was supposed to be to prevent tyranny. Somebody's getting a little too hyper popular, and they could undermine the democracy just because they have so much control. In reality, though, the people who were ostracized tended to be the people who were not very popular. It was the people who were on the downside. Cymon was more of a threat in 465 and 464 when he had enough influence to kick Themistocles out. That's when he was a danger to become a tyrant. Now he's a disgrace. Oh my God, that was terrible advice you gave us. No, but you tend to get ostracized for being unpopular rather than for being too popular. So it becomes a political weapon and a political tool.
Unpopular means like notorious, not just not popular.
Yeah, It's not a matter of, but we don't care about you. You're insignificant. Yeah, you would never get ostracized for being a zero. You would get ostracized because you did something that it's like, oh my God, what a loser! You've annoyed us. Get out.
For 10 years.
But 10 years, and then after 10 years, you're back. It is a big chunk. We know of people who came back though, for sure. Like I say, you don't lose your property. It's not like being exiled. Like we think of it being exiled, you lose your rights, you lose all your property is confiscated. That tends to happen like in the Roman Empire a lot. It even happens here a bit. In fact, when Themistocles goes and gets a job with the Persians, he is ruled a traitor and they confiscate all his property back home. But he doesn't care because he's making a bomb in Persia, so whatever. So they do that. But ostracism is just go on a 10-year holiday. And when you're done, you can come back and everything will be fine. You'll have all your property, all your citizen rights.
It's a 10-year timeout.
Yeah, it is. It totally is a 10-year timeout. Oh, gosh, you must have thrown a lot of toys out of your playpen for a 10-year timeout. Anyway, the growth of Athens was such that by 431, there were almost 500 members. I was impressed by 150, but this is like triple. And these are 500 separate little communities that have all agreed to join the party, which itself is a bit of an amazing thing. Anyway, so there was, I don't want to get into this too much because I want to get to the Peloponnesian War, but you had things like Athens at one point, Megara, Thebes, they actually controlled that area as well as their naval. Didn't last very long, but they actually had that much control, and they were that's significantly more than what Sparta brought. And they battled back and forth, and sometimes Athens won battles, and sometimes Sparta won. Eventually, they concluded a peace. Not that there had been sort of declared war, but just constant bickering. So they declared a 30-year peace in 445. They agreed what the Peloponnesian League would look like. Okay, these communities, they are under the Spartan hegemony. These communities, they're under Athenian hegemony. And by the way, the Ionians, they're under Persian rule, which is kind of ironic because a lot of the Persian War was over that very thing, and they just gave them up. Now they did, because the Persians were involved in the discussions as well. The Persians agreed that the poleis in Ionia were autonomous. So they could have their own currency, their own local government. They didn't have to answer as direct subjects of the Persian Empire. But they did have to respect the Persian Empire. They couldn't be attacking the Persian Empire. Anyway, so this 30-year peace didn't last 30 years. It lasted 14 years. But during that 14 years, Athens continues to rebuild. Part of the rebuild is more walls. Just think how much fun Trump would have had. More walls. They built a second wall down to the coast there. This, intuitively, I look at this and I think, okay, now this is just excessive, right? Like, now you're just doing it for the sake of doing it. There's a couple of good, can anyone think of a couple of good reasons why this might be useful?
Another layer of shield to keep people on their end, so that you've got a big area of land that you can still protect.
Yes.
You've got 2 layers of protection.
Yeah. So what would that, what value would you get out of that extra land? Farming is one. Anything else? More people. If you do have to evacuate the countryside, instead of everybody stuck in the city or here, you now have a whole bunch more places they can camp out. So yeah, the land there is valuable. The other thing is, you can see the Piraeus is a really good area. This isn't a bad harbor either. So you have access to a lot more harbor as well. So, and yeah, a large area could house people, could be used for agriculture, mainly just housing people. The Spartans didn't like this, and they actually tried, they didn't like the original walls going up. They certainly didn't like this extra one going up. They tried to get the Athenians to take it down, but they couldn't really force the issue. So they couldn't do much about it, and up it went. Because everybody playing this game, whether you were an Athenian or a Spartan, knew that adding yet another wall is just going to diminish the Spartans' ability to control the Athenians. And that takes us to the Persian War. And there is a schematic showing the sides, yellow versus pink, in a winner-take-all battle. So, I don't want to get too bogged down. The background's kind of interesting because you can see how the Hellenic peoples divided up, how they organized themselves after the Persians. I'm going to zing through this part because we're now getting into the details of the war in terms of on this date, this battle happened, that kind of stuff. A couple of them are hyper interesting, but most of it is just dates and events that don't get a lot of analysis really. So, leading up to the Peloponnesian War, typically when you get 2 major powers that get into war, they don't usually butt heads immediately. It's usually little things going off in the periphery that start this. So, for instance, Athens and Corinth got into some scrapes, and Corinth was an ally of Sparta. So they got into a scrape over Corcyra because Corcyra was a Corinthian colony, but they joined the Athenian alliance, which didn't make Corinth very happy. They felt threatened. There was issues with Naupactus being a member or not being a member. And then you had a place like Potidaea way up there who decided they didn't really want to be a member anymore. Not because they were astoundingly unhappy with Athens, but just they didn't feel there was much threat. There's not really any reason. There's nothing to defend ourselves against, so can we leave? And the Athenians tended to say, no. It's like protection. Little scrapes like that eventually caused the 2 major powers to blow up at each other. Peloponnesian League declared war on Athens in 431. By the way, it's like a 30-year peace, and it got interrupted about halfway through. And you might even question 30-year peace. That was about as long as it was expected. The Greeks tended to think that being at some level of conflict with somebody else was more a natural state of existence. Anyway, so the war, it goes on for 27 years, almost 3 times as long as the Trojan War. The first part of it, and it divides kind of neatly into sections. So the first part's about a 6-year part where the Spartans invaded Attica every year. They attacked the farms, they burnt the crops, the Athenians retreated into their walls, and they attacked Spartan communities by sea. Couldn't attack Sparta directly because it's too far inland, but they would attack Spartan allies by sea. You might think, by the way, when you look at it, it's like attacking farms and burning crops. Fortunately for the Athenians, olive trees and grapevines are really tough and can survive a fair bit of abuse. Anyway, the Athenians, despite having their territory invaded every year, enjoyed a number of successes. Amphilochia, for instance, was where they defeated Spartan forces. The big one, though, is where you can see there on Pylos. That was a major success that they had. But they also suffered during the war. The first thing that they suffered, apart from having their fields devastated, and had kind of starting to lose the farmers' enthusiasm for this, because the farmers feel like they're taking the brunt of the pain and not getting enough consideration for that. But crowding all those people into a small space, and we're talking hundreds of thousands, caused a plague to erupt. We know a lot about the plague because Thucydides actually caught the plague and survived it. So he could tell us quite a bit about the story, and it was kind of horrific, particularly when it came to trying to bury people. But it killed an estimated quarter of the population, which is amazing that Athens could still be a strong force when you lose that many people. But one person in particular who was lost was Pericles, who was the grand architect for the previous 12, 14 years. He had been a guiding figure in Athenian policy, whether it was foreign affairs, rebuilding, whatever. He caught the plague, he died, and they lost his expertise. And in a world where you define success by the leaders, that was devastating. Anyway, but like I say, they also enjoyed a number of successes. Their hold on their allies remained pretty good. You didn't get defections of people wanting to leave the alliance, and particularly Pylos. Control the sea. The big one, though, was they captured 292 Spartan citizens. Now remember, a few hundred Spartans were killed, and that started the Messenians a revolt that lasted for 9 years. So 292 citizens, that's a big one. 122 of their elite soldiers among that group. They didn't kill them, they just held them prisoner and used them as hostages to make the Spartans behave. So for instance, it's like, we have 292 of your citizens. You're going to stop invading Athens or Attica now, aren't you? Yes. So this is where it happened, by the way. You can see it's very exposed to the sea, which is why the Athenians were successful there. So this was a major bargaining chip that the Athenians got. And eventually it led to a truce. That is how desperately the Spartans wanted to get their citizens back. It didn't last very long, and they started fighting again. And I mentioned that they fought over this place called Amphipolis, which is an Athenian colony. Very young little town. It only started up in 437. Up here, doesn't seem like it's that. Is that really a strategic place? Do we really need to know about this place? It's useful to know because the Spartan general Brasidas, who was a big mover in the let's keep fighting the Athenians, let's beat them, let's beat on them till we win, went up to lead the Spartan forces. And against him was a leader who kind of took over from Pericles as the major leader of the Athenians, named Cleon, who also was a hawk who wanted to pursue the war. They fought a battle in which they both died. And suddenly each side lost the individual who was really pushing to keep on pursuing the war. And so now that created a situation where those who were more interested in coming to a truce or coming to an agreement could step forward now. With the Hawks dead, they concluded a 30-year peace. We call it the Peace of Nicias because he was very involved on the Athenian side for negotiating the peace, negotiating the terms. And in 421, we had supposedly an end to the Peloponnesian War. And it did last 6 entire years. Phase 2 was 415 to 404. Neither side was following the terms of the peace. They were both cheating. And then an opportunity cropped up for the Athenians to attack Syracuse. Now, does anyone tell me where Syracuse is?
Italy?
Yes, it's in Sicily. Okay, nowhere near the Spartans. There we are. We can see how far away Syracuse is from Athens and from Sparta. What happened was, you can see there, I don't want to walk away too far from the microphone, Segesta, which is on the northwest end of Sicily. They weren't happy with Syracuse, and Syracuse kind of controlled all of Sicily. And they said, if you send a force over to free us from Syracuse, and maybe even beat the Syracusans, we will pay for it. We will fund the operation. There's Syracuse, by the way. And when they actually got there, it turned out that the Segestans had been lying through their teeth. They didn't have the money to fund this at all. So there were two main people in this discussion. Alcibiades, who was saying, yes, let's do this, because the Syracusans had a pretty strong navy. The Syracusans were allies of Sparta. They weren't massively involved in the war, but they were certainly giving Sparta some access to naval, to ships, and to the ability to do some things at sea. And Athens' strategy was, we control the sea entirely. Syracusans are undermining that. But if we got rid of them, yeah. Anyway, so there's Alcibiades, and he's saying, yeah, let's do this. And against him was Nicias, who was like, no, let's not. Let's just keep doing what we're doing because it's working. Then weirdness happened. And this has got to be talked. So first of all, who's Alcibiades? So he's one of the more fun, colorful characters of the ancient world. And even if we allow for exaggeration, he's still one of the more fun, colorful characters of the ancient world. Born in 450. So at this stage, he's in his 30s. He was a strategos, so he was one of the 10 elected military leaders for 5 years, up to the Sicilian expedition and the mutilation of the Herms. Then he was an advisor to the Spartans for 3 years against the Athenians. Then he was an advisor to the Persians against the Spartans. Then he was let back into Athens again, where he was a strategos. Then he was exiled in 406, and he was murdered in 404. So he was Athenian, Spartan, Persian, Athenian, dead. All in the span of 16 years. That's living large. Anyway, he was also a follower of Socrates, by the way. Socrates was very much connected to Alcibiades and vice versa. And in general, he sort of had a cocky attitude towards life. It made him really popular when things were going well because he's kind of a, he's interesting, he's successful, he's attractive. But on the other hand, when things went well, then it's like, oh, he's weird. And so I would describe him as very polarizing. Anyway, so that's just a little thumbnail sketch. Some of it is spoiler alert because I'm telling you what happened in the future. At 415, they debated about should we send a force to Sicily to conquer Syracuse, which Segesta offered to fund. So the assembly got together, and here's how democracy works. They got together and they voted to send 60 ships and 12,000 men. No hoplites, no fully armed soldiers. They're sending rowers and they're sending light armed troops. So schematically, here's what 60 ships could be represented by. They met 5 days later because in the Athenian democracy, you decide every little jot and tittle. You don't have okay, now we're going to send this to the experts to decide how this is going to work. Nope, the people decide. What are the logistics of the expedition going to be? Nicias gets the idea that he wants to change people's minds, and you can do that in the assembly. They could say, you know what, we changed our mind, we're not going to send the expedition after all. We thought about it and it's a silly idea. So he decides he's going to try to talk them out of it. If you're Nicias, how might you try to do that? Any thoughts? How would you? They've already decided to send 60 ships and 12,000 men.
Where 12,000 men going?
They're going to be rowers, probably the lower levels. Rowers, light armed troops. You're not sending the fully armed hoplites. Yeah, okay, yeah. It's like, oh, here's another theater of war that is, yeah. Well, he doesn't work. So he tries reverse psychology. It's like the big budget, ridiculously large force. He suggests, well, then if we're going to do this, we should do this properly. We can't do this unless we send this many ships and this many troops.
It works.
And it works brilliantly for Alcibiades.
Yep.
So they send over 100 ships and 5,000 hoplites and 25,000 men. So that's what schematically, that's what it grew to.
It's so fun.
Yes. They pretty much doubled the force and sent 5,000 core soldiers. Going all in, even before the turn. Anyway, so that's all set up. On the eve of the departure, however, there was something that was considered to be really bad luck that happened. This is a Herm. It's a statue of Hermes, which is basically just a square pillar with a head and an erection. They had the mutilation of the Herms. Someone mentioned that before. It's supposed to be good luck, by the way. A Herm started off as just a pile of stones, and then over time they got a little more artistic with it. A group of people ran around one night, and they knocked off all the noses and penises. Not of every single Herm, but of a whole lot of them throughout the city. And there's actually a depiction of somebody attacking the nose. There's another. So you can see this was sufficiently big in the psyche that they put this on pottery, on multiple pieces of pottery. Alcibiades got blamed for this. It seems weird that you could, it's like, what? But because he lived kind of a wild party lifestyle, they could imagine that he did this. Just, they got drunk, they're celebrating that they're going to be going off, and they just, some mindless violence and vandalism. We don't know. This is one of these great mysteries in history. We have no idea who did this. Was it a conspiracy against Alcibiades, where people went out to do this, and it's like, oh my God, this is bad luck. We shouldn't proceed with the expedition because we just had this bad luck happen to us. Yeah.
Why in the first kind of image does the guy who's knocking the erection down also have no clothes and a massive erection? Like,
well,
Anastasia, that's a good one.
So that could very well be a portrayal of, in fact, I would say it was a portrayal of the mutilation of Hermes in a comedy. And comedy was always topical. Tragedy is about mythic events that happened in the legendary past. Comedy is about what's happening right now. So my guess is, because that's a satyr. So it could have been a satyr drama or it could have been a comedy. And in comedies, particularly, all the characters wore fake penises. Think about that. Maybe that will encourage a little bit. Think about that when you're reading the Lysistrata, which is about a sex strike. All the characters have fake penises. Well, the male characters. Anyway, no charges were brought, and Alcibiades and Nicias were two of the three major commanders who went. No charges were brought, by the way, because most of the people going on the expedition were pro-Alcibiades. And so they would have, if they got allotted to being on the jury to bring this to court, they would have voted for acquittal, no matter what the evidence was. Get rid of them. Get rid of all these pro-Alcibiades people so that when you do the jury selection, they're not available. It's totally gamifying the system. Anyway, the Athenian plan was to blockade the city of Syracuse by building a wall. This is what you do in the 5th century. You build walls. And they basically had a wall building race where the Athenians tried to surround Syracuse with a wall, and then somebody tries to, oh no, we're going to block that wall so you can't build. I know, it's so weird. I mean, it's like the most slow motion race you can imagine.
Were they fighting while they were building?
Well, they probably did skirmish, but mainly it was building.
So they're like right next to each other, building walls like aggressively.
Well, it's like this one's coming this way, this one's coming this way. Anyway, this one got first. I mean, they're probably like a kilometer away, right? But it feels weird. Anyway, the Athenians lost the wall building race. They did try to attack Syracuse with their navy, but with Spartan help, the Syracusans defeated the Athenians. The Athenians could have left at that point, but they didn't. And part of it was there was like an eclipse of the moon, if I remember correctly. And the general who was in charge was superstitious and thought we can't do anything until the next full moon. And while they waited, they totally got I can't find something. Stop. Anyway, so they sort of basically hung around until they could, and they got captured. The entire force was lost, 25,000 men. Most of them were killed, some of them were sold into slavery. If they had sent the original force, they were still lost, but they wouldn't have gone in so heavily. The loss wouldn't have been so brutal. Anyway, after the expedition left, Alcibiades' enemies, that's when they put a motion in that he be tried. So he knew he was going to lose that, and that's why he went over to the Spartans. And he advised the Spartans what can you do? Here's something you guys can do to beat the Athenians, and that is capture the town of Decelea, which is at a high point, fortify it, and now you can harass all of Attica. And you can also keep tabs on Athens, because in fact Decelea has a view of Athens from the high point of the hills. Nice. I imagine the Spartans might have thought of this one by themselves, but Alcibiades got credit for giving them the advice. So they perched there basically until the end of the war. They harassed the Athenians and caused trouble. You might not think it was that big a deal. After all, they still got their walls, right? They're still safe in there. However, this is kind of like Pylos, except in reverse. Instead of the Athenians having territory and hostages in Sparta, you have the Spartans having territory in Athens. And it's close to Thebes, and Thebes is an ally. So in terms of supplying this garrison, they don't need to be supplied. They just have to be supplied from Thebes or Megara. It's easy. So for the rest of the war, Sparta could keep an eye on Athens. Interesting piece of information we get from Thucydides is that for 9 years, it's estimated that about 20,000 slaves, 20,000 Athenian slaves, escaped to Decelea. We have no idea what happened to them. And we don't even know if that's a particularly reliable number. But that's, first of all, it shows a lot of dissatisfaction. But again, that's very socially disruptive to lose 20,000 people that you rely on to do all the work. Anyway, here's a whole bunch of stuff I don't want to go into details about, but after the Syracusan disaster, things started to fall apart. They fell apart within the city. So in the year 411, you had an oligarch, you had a coup. 400. It was a bloodless coup because it was more or less decided by the assembly that it was like, we make stupid decisions. We decided to go to Sicily. That was dumb. Let's put the government in the hands of 400 people, 40 from each tribe. So they're not totally dismantling the political process. They are just redefining it. 400 people. That didn't last very long, like a month. And then they put the rule in the hands of 5,000 people, which is like one big ass oligarchy. There was the Battle of Cynossema. The democracy was stored in 410. So you can see that's a lot of disruption to change your government 3 times in the course of less than 2 years, right? Some major battles that occurred, the worst of which was Aegospotami, where the Athenians lost. Oh, by the way, you notice Battle of Cyzicus. The Athenians won that, and they won it so convincingly that the Spartans actually sued for peace. And now that the Athenians were riding high, they said no.
Should they have said yes?
General consensus, yes. Because 5 years later, they lost a battle so badly that their entire fleet was destroyed. That was the end of it. And Athens had to give in the next year. They had to just total surrender. Now, in the context of that, 411, when you had all those coups, democracy becomes the rule of 400, becomes the rule of 5,000. That was the year that the Lysistrata was performed. So when we talk about historical contexts, that's a huge historical context. Keep in mind that all that was going on, the Lysistrata was being performed. The Lysistrata was performed in March. The oligarchic coup happened in June. So that gives you an idea. It hadn't happened yet, but these things don't happen suddenly. There was obviously some buildup. Anyway, so after the disaster, you had a coup, then you had a reverse coup, And you had things like the entire island of Euboea revolted. And that's right off the coast of Attica. That's scary stuff. There it is there. That's really revolting. That close, that big, that's scary. Anyway, the war draws to a close. Like I say, these are where the battles took place. You notice none of them are in Greece. The reason why these battles are taking place here is all about food security.
Food. Get to food.
Yes. It's all about keeping the channels open so that grain can get to the city. That became obviously a major focus, and that's why the naval battles are happening there, because Athens wants to make sure that it can feed its people. So, just kind of interesting little side note, that's what's driving the strategy. Anyway, poor Athens out. So, conclusion, last slide. Spartans gain hegemony over Greece. They are now the undisputed leaders. Athenians had to dismantle their walls. Interesting side note. Corinth actually, when they got together and discussed this, the Spartan allies discussed this, Corinth was, let's wipe Athens off the face of the earth. Let's destroy it, kill all the men, sell all the women and children into slavery. And Sparta said no. Not because they loved Athens, although they said, oh no, Athens did too much work for the Greek world. We can't do that to such pro-Hellenists. The real reason was they didn't want Corinth to now become the one and only naval power in the Greek world. So anyway, Sparta tried to impose a very tiny little oligarchy. Didn't work. The year after, the Athenians revolted against the Spartan-backed oligarchy. And by the way, those 30 people were all Athenians. It wasn't like the Spartans came in and tried to rule. They just set up Athenians as an oligarchy. The Athenians turfed them, restored the democracy, and Sparta basically let them. It wasn't worth trying to fight that one. So Sparta is large and in charge, won't last long. In fact, the Athenians will come back. And over the next 70 years, no, less than that, 60 years, there's going to be toing and froing and Persia getting involved like you wouldn't believe. But there we have it. There's the Peloponnesian War, all done.